Hey, welcome to Hear God's Word. This is Michael Loinger. In this podcast, we study and dissect the Bible to better understand what it means and is trying to say. We'll cover theology and dig into the original meaning through language and word studies. We'll even discuss scientific and historical ties, but we'll always come back to the basics. There's so many layers to the Bible, and it's all important. So, if you want to hear what God has to say, then let's dive in. Hey everyone. So today we're going to be continuing with the story of Abraham, but we are going to be wrapping up the story of Sarah, because if you look right away at Genesis 23, it begins by saying, Sarah lived 127 years. Verse 2, then she died in Kiriath Arba, that is Hebron, in the land of Canaan. Abraham went to mourn for Sarah and to weep for her. So, jumping straight into it, we see that the mother of Isaac and Abraham's true and original wife, she's now passed away. And it starts out by saying she was 127. So let's start by looking at that. I know we've had the conversation before about Genesis 6 in verse 3, where it talks about how it says, my spirit won't strive with man forever because he is also flesh. Nevertheless, his days shall be 120 years. So here we can see that it's talking about things in relation to how corrupt stuff had gotten back with the Nephilim and the sons of God and that story. So essentially, because people were corrupt, it's either A, saying that people aren't to live past 120, or this is essentially the standard cap of people's lives going forward. Or we also talked about how this verse isn't even talking about that, and it was actually talking about how there were going to be 120 years left that people had to live before the flood comes. And we actually had looked at that, and that's essentially accurate. It was maybe ironic that it could mean both, because there were approximately 120 years between the time where God makes this declaration and where the ark is ready and the flood happens. And so, take for this what you will, but going back to the story of Sarah, she lives to 127. So, considering that, did she cheat the number? Well, no, we've seen other people who have lived past 120 since after the flood. And so, are we going to say that those were also mistakes? Obviously, what seems clear is that the flood did change the dynamics, and I think it's clear that God also meant both of these things. Like, his spirit's not going to put up with humans for the same long period of time. And so we've talked about it before, but most likely there were some changes in the atmosphere and environment that caused the decline of lifespans and sizes of people. And we can see even in the fossil records, people used to be a little bit bigger, and animals used to be quite a bit bigger as well. At least this is seemingly the evidence we found from some fossil records. And so Sarah is living a nice and full life. Let's talk about that because, of course, she definitely lived a messy life. She had lied to multiple kings and allowed them to take her as their woman for a little bit. And if it wasn't God stepping in both times, things would have been screwed up. And yet, she didn't even have faith she was going to have a kid, even when God promised. So she definitely had her issues, her struggles, her flaws, and her mistakes. But we can see God eventually delivered on the promise, and she ends up having a kid at 90 years old. So that means it's been 37 years since Isaac is born. He's about 37 now. So the fact is, Sarah's gotten to see him grow up to be a adult, essentially. And we also can glean potentially something, like I was saying, about it being a complete life. The notion of 127. So 120, we could maybe go back to even what it was saying in Genesis 6 and say that essentially 120 is potentially a metaphor for something being completed within one's lifetime amount. And so we know a lot of the numbers in the Bible are symbolic. It's possible that this was her exact age, and it's possible God lined it up to be very ironic. But just as we know that Noah built the ark and the flood came within his lifetime, we also see this fact that Sarah was promised, and although she didn't have a lot of faith, especially at first, she ends up becoming the mother of many and a mother of faith. And so we can look to her as that kind of mother of the faith because she did end up carrying the son that God promised her, and she got to experience life with him for 37 years. That's a pretty amazing and generous amount from God, especially considering that she didn't think she was ever going to get to live to see a child. And so I think that this is really beautiful. And so if you add 7 to 120, if the number potentially is symbolic, meaning that she lived a life that was full, and 7 being the number of completion, it possibly is referring to how she ended up living a full life, essentially. And as we move on to verse 2, it talks about how she died in a place called Kiriath Arba. But then we have this interesting note that it's actually Hebron. And we've been talking about Hebron, if you remember. We've mentioned how Hebron has appeared even as far back as chapter 13 and verse 8, where it talks about how he settled in that land. And then we also have record of him settling in the Oaks of Mamre, which is nearby. So in comparison, Hebron is a little bit to the east of the Oaks of Mamre. And an interesting point about Mamre is, if we remember back to chapter 14, verse 13, it talks about Mamre the Amorite, and we know the Amorites were spread from the west of the Jordan, pretty far north and south, all the way over into where Israel / Canaan at that time was. Amorites were obviously one of the big groups of people. So it's no wonder that Mamre had a lot of status. And the fact that Abraham creates a partnership with them and settles in their land and has pretty good favor is a good start for him. And in fact, we were talking about covenant. He essentially did create a covenant with them. And this actually helps set the tone of the covenant that he makes with God. And there's actually a connection. He has this covenant with the people around him and essentially peace and alliance with the neighbors, as well as he has this promise and alliance with God. So as we talked about, Hebron is east of Mamre. As we read earlier, though, it actually goes by another name here, and that's Kiryat Arba. And I know we've talked about this before, but the Bible is interesting because many names have changed in ancient history. And so the name at that point was Kiryat Arba, and essentially the meaning of the place is fellowship or association. And so it seems as if it was a very relational town because we see even Abraham was a foreigner there, technically speaking, but he settles down and he calls it home. So as we continue on, we see that Abraham starts mourning his wife's loss, and all these things together set up the story of what is about to take place. So in one sense, that was a highlight point of what just happened, but it's also, in a way, an intro to the story that's about to take place. And as we can see, Sarah kind of has transitional stories. The story is mainly focused on Abraham, but then we also see it cutting away for chapters to Lot and all these interesting things. So we see that there's a lot to Abraham's life. And obviously, this comes with losing his wife. And so the question is, how does he deal with this? So starting in verse 3, it says, "Then Abraham got up from mourning his dead wife and said to the sons of Heth, 'I'm a foreign resident, a temporary settler among you. Grant me ownership of a burial site among you so that I may bury my dead.' The sons of Heth answered Abraham, 'Listen, sir, you're a mighty prince among us. You may bury your dead in the choicest of our tombs. None of us will refuse you his tomb to prevent you from burying your dead.'" So we can already see here that Abraham is earning some big time favor. Well, actually, like I've talked about, he's already earned it. His reputation already precedes him. And people know that he's an influential man. They also know he's a very powerful and faithful man. And they also view him as a strong and a good leader, because we can see that they actually refer to him as a mighty prince. So let's talk about verse 3. So starting off, after Abraham is finished grieving, he obviously has not gotten to fully finish the grieving process, but at least when he got done with the initial mourning, he needed to, as he says later in verse 4, bury his wife. And the first thing he does after finishes mourning is he talks with the sons of Heth. So this is the interesting thing about the Bible. So I know very early on in the episodes, we talked a lot about Bible studying techniques. And if you remember, as we've talked about genealogies a lot, when it says sons of so and so, it's not literally talking about, as we go back to Genesis 10:15, we remember seeing that Canaan actually became the father of Het, which is the actual pronunciation of Heth. And who exactly are the sons of Heth? It's actually the Chati, and these are the individuals that we know as the Hittites. And so we know a decent amount about them, and we know they lived all the way spanning from Anatolia and regions of Turkey and Syria all the way down through Canaan, down into Israel, we can obviously see here. And so we have the sons of Heth, which Abraham is going to, and he approaches them, we can see, with respect, because the first thing that he says is, I'm a foreign resident, a temporary settler among you. And this is a humble stance for him to take, especially considering how highly regarded he was by many, to approach them like this. It just keeps the good relationship and blood between them. And the fact that truly he doesn't really own the land. None of it is technically his. But as we consider another aspect, technically God promised him this land. And so how do we rectify this? It's because God promised it to his descendants for the future. And Abraham knows that he doesn't have any right to be like, hey, fools, give me some land so I can bury my wife. That's not going to keep a good relationship between him and his allies. That's going to cause tension. So he requests that he can actually have some ownership of a burial site if he can purchase it. And he wants a place that he can actually call his own and have ownership and possession of. And we see this reflected because he specifically asks that of them. He wants some property, and he technically says give here. So the question is he asking for them to give him the land for free, or is he asking, is it okay if I buy? We know by what he's originally saying that he's a foreigner. He's not originally from there. He's originally from the city of Ur in Acadia / Samaria, Babylon. But then he also lived a small chunk of his life up in Aram. But he's come here. He spent a lot of his time, he spent a little bit of time down in Egypt, but he spent the majority and a good chunk of his life now at this point in Canaan. He's built favor, but it also says that he's a temporary resident, and we read settler, but I think resident would be a good term because it means someone who lives and dwells at a certain place. But it doesn't indicate that he was a citizen or that he owned any land. And so him taking this both bold and humble stance at the same time, and requesting that he can get some land for his wife. He wants to be able to go back to this site. He doesn't want to have to bury his wife where he's living right now, because it says at the end he wants to bury her out of his sight. And it doesn't say that specifically in the version that we read, but if you look at the original Hebrew, it says that he wanted to bury her somewhere where he's not living. Because could you imagine having your mom's burial site in your backyard? I mean, it could be a nice and positive thing, but it could also be a really negative thing and always bring negative thoughts and memories. The fact that your dead loved one is just one look out the tent window. Abraham also doesn't really want to bury her in another person's private space, because he might not be able to go back and visit her in the future, or future generations won't be able to. But if he has actual land or property, as it says, then it'll be his. And throughout all the generations in the future, as long as his land isn't stolen from him, he can go ahead at any point and visit his deceased wife. And we'll also see in the future that it's going to become actually a family grave site. So not just his wife, but future generations as well. So we move on as it begins to give us an answer, because it says the sons of Heth actually answered him, and they said, "Listen, sir, you're a mighty prince among us." And like we talked about, that's a very highly esteemed statement. So this is going to be really uncomfortable for a lot of Christian audience to hear, and it even makes me feel weird, and sometimes I have to figure out how to culturally understand what is being said here. But when it says, "Listen, sir," it technically is saying, "Listen, my Lord," or "my master." And it actually uses the word Adonai. So this is one of the names for God, but it's not calling him that. At least we're going to get to some of the other words down here, which are going to also be uncomfortable. But just as the word sir in English, I don't know if you know this, but it means master. And the word master is another parallel term to Lord. So when we say, "Hey, sir," you're technically saying, "Hey, Lord," but it's not talking about the Lord or God. The term Adonai here is a term of respect to call someone, such as back in the olden days, they used to say, "Hey, my Lord." In the same way, here, we could simplify it down to, "Hey, sir." It's a term of acknowledgement of respect. This next part, though, where it calls him Nasi Elohim, is where it gets uncomfortable. So Nasi means a prince or a chief. So it's essentially a tribe leader. And we know that Abraham does have his own house of Abraham. We know that he has many servants and that he has his own people. So he is the chief or leader. So the term here, prince, does mean a leader or a chief or the head of a tribe. And you're probably familiar with this next part, but it says Elohim, so he's a Nasi Elohim. This is an interesting term because essentially, if we really break it down, the best definition I would say is a leader of God. And in their mind, since they have gods, it's possible that they view him as someone who is a leader spiritually when they're calling him this name. And they know that he's a pretty mighty man of faith. I'm sure most people couldn't go very long after meeting Abraham without knowing that he was a follower of El Shaddai, God Almighty. So to boil it down, these people are saying that among us, you're considered to be a very spiritually influential person, and we respect you. This informs what they say next, which is that they're not going to hold back any of their burial sites from him, and he can take his choice of whatever site he wants, and they won't hold back or say no. Even if he was to choose the most luxurious and the best of all sites, they would let him have it. This is a lot of respect they have. So then it says that Abraham stands up in verse 7 and he bows down to the people of the land and the sons of Heth. And this is obviously a sign of respect. He is thanking them for their generosity. And then what happens next? We continue reading in verse 8. It says, "Then he said to them, 'If you agree that I may bury my dead, then hear me out. Ask Ephron, the son of Zohar, if he'll sell me the cave of Machpelah that belongs to him. It is at the end of his field. Let him sell it to me publicly for the full price, so that I may own it as a burial site.'" And this gets at what we were talking about before. How are they going to play this game? So I wanted to bring up a little bit of ancient Near East cultural context, which is that many times they would go back and forth. And if Abraham wouldn't have offered any land, they might have let him have it. But kind of like if you were to say, like, "Hey, let me pay for your meal." If you were to be like, "Oh, okay," the person obviously asked you, so they'll do it. But they kind of expect, if you're a kind and able person, that you say, "Oh, no, don't worry about it. I can cover." And then if they say again, "No, I insist," then you further negotiate from there. But here, Abraham is fully capable of purchasing the land. So the sons of Heth obviously highly esteem Abraham, but he doesn't want to do them dirty. And he also wants to apply wisdom. For example, if he does take this burial site, but it's not technically his land, if someone else comes in to own the land at a later point, and then he tries to go visit his dead, they'll be like, whoa, I don't even know you, man. It could definitely stir up disputes if he doesn't lock this in through the proper means and in a legal fashion. So then after Abraham asks, and then they give him freely any land he wants as an offer, he tells them, "No, at least let me purchase it," because even think back to the story when he rescued the Sodomites, they offered him as much of the spoils as he wanted to take back. But he's like, nope, you guys can keep that. I don't want to be responsible later on. So Abraham is obviously a man of wisdom. We see that he's very intelligent. He has a lot of street smarts and intuition, and he's even very diplomatic when it comes to matters connecting with groups of people. And he's very smart in the way that he networks and relates with the people around him. Then, as verse 10 begins, there's a twist. Apparently, Ephron is actually sitting out in the crowd, or he's in listening range. He's among the people, and we can see in verse 10 that they're actually by the gate. And we know in ancient culture that a lot of people congregated and assembled by the gate. And many times there were, I guess you could say, town meetings, or when there were leaders, they would meet down by the gate area. And this is where a lot of community activity and hearings took place. And obviously, Abraham came to have an audience. So he went to where he knew that the sons of Heth would be able to hear him. I also quickly find it interesting that Abraham already knew and had scouted out what field and cave he wanted. So now we get to verse 10, and it says, Now Ephron was sitting among the sons of Heth, Ephron the Hittite. And here we see that a son of Heth is a Hittite. Ephron replied to Abraham in the hearing of the sons of Heth before all who entered the gate of his city. So, as I was mentioning before, they were all gathered by the gate because this is where the community met. And it says all the sons of Heth, not every single Hittite, obviously, but all of them that were in the city there. And at least all the influential people seem to have been meeting at that time. So Abraham probably learned and found out when they were there, or he had seen them meeting and he knew what time they would be there. So he went and approached them at this time, and different people, I'm sure, had the floor, or there were downtimes, and when someone had something to bring up, then they would allow them to be able to speak. So it says specifically that this is a hearing. Literally, it says that Abraham was in the ear of the sons of Heth. So all that were gathered there and could hear him. It's clear that Ephron is obviously in the crowd, which he didn't know that Ephron specifically would be at the meeting, and he might not have even known what he looked like, but he probably heard that the land was his. Either that or he had interacted with him, but the crowd and the gathering was so big that he just didn't see him there. So Ephron, who's sitting down, which could be another reason he wasn't seen, ends up saying to him in verse 11, No, my lord, hear me out. I'll give you both the field and the cave that's in it, in the presence of my people. I give it to you to bury your dead. So we can see this back and forth wager. We have Abraham asking for land, then them saying, we'll give it to you. But then he says, no, let me pay for it. But then the guy who owns the field stands up and says, hey, I'll give it to you. Don't worry about it. You can have the field and the cave. So then in verse 12, it says, Abraham bowed before the local people and said to Ephron in their hearing, Hear me, if you will. I pay to you the price of the field. Take it from me so that I may bury my dead there. We see one more time with the actual owner of the land himself that Abraham keeps that same integrity, and he insists to pay it in full because he doesn't want any trouble in the future. Even if he was given it for free, there could be ambiguity in ownership, even if the land was given to him. Then, as it continues on, it says, Ephron answered Abraham, saying to him, Hear me, my lord, the land is worth 400 pieces of silver, but what is that between me and you? So bury your dead. So Abraham agreed to Ephron's price and weighed out for him the price that Ephron had quoted in the hearing of the sons of Heth, 400 pieces of silver, according to the standard measurement at the time. So Abraham secured Ephron's field in Machpelah next to Mamre, including the field, the cave that was in it, and all the trees that were in the field and all around its border, as his property in the presence of the sons of Heth, before all who entered the gate of Ephron's city. After this, Abraham buried his wife Sarah in the cave and in the field of Machpelah next to Mamre, that is Hebron, in the land of Canaan. So Abraham secured the field and the cave that was in it as a burial site from the sons of Heth. So we obviously went through a lot there in this last portion. So after they go back and forth a few times, which we learned was ancient Near East tradition, we have them settling on a price. Ephron answers and tells Abraham that the silver that it was worth, or the full price that the land technically was, would be 400 shekels, which I'll give you guys some homework. If you don't remember back to any future podcast episodes about what a shekel was, go ahead and do some research and find out what a shekel is. And after politely going back and forth, and even Ephron calls Abraham my lord as well, so we can see Abraham bowing down to Ephron once he realizes he's actually in the assembly of people, and he wants to obviously be on good terms so that this deal does go through. And they both pay respect to each other, and then they agree on the price, 400 shekels, as we mentioned. And then he said, but what's that between me and you? And so, again, look up what shekels is and do an AI search to look at conversions. But it was, at least at that time, quite a bit of money. But remember, in order for someone to own a field or multiple properties, obviously they had to have been wealthy. We know that Abraham was very well off and wealthy. So there's two senses of the word. There is that, hey, this isn't really a lot of money compared to everything we already have. It's just a penny in the bank. But it also is a little bit relational because he's also saying, hey, between the two of us, I mean, this is just land, and you're obviously an honorable man, so I want you to be able to have this land. Let's make this deal happen. And so we see that Abraham goes ahead and confirms the deal. And in verse 16, it says that he agreed on Ephron's price and weighed it. And so here we can see shekels is not a fiscal amount, but it's a weight. So he had to weigh the silver or the money, which was silver, in the measurement of shekels. So I kind of gave you a little bit of info. So after it says they named the price and they began weighing it, it says that it was according to the standard of the merchants. So it's clear, to be fair, that they were using merchant standards at that time to make sure that everything was done fairly. So all of this was done publicly, from the weighing to the giving over of the land. And it was obviously important since Abraham approached publicly. He also wanted to do things in the open, and Ephron wanted to do that as well, so that both parties got what they agreed over. And we see that not only did Abraham get the field and the cave as they agreed on, but he also got all around the border, all of the land within. And it specifically mentions the trees because he was living in the oaks of Mamre, and it literally says in verse 17 that Machpelah was next to Mamre. So I'm sure there were plenty of good trees there, and this just made him even more wealthy because he technically could turn it into a lumber business if he wanted to. We see that in verse 18, it continues to elaborate on how all of this was in the presence of the sons of Heth, so that there were witnesses, and also so that all the sons of Heth actually knew that this deal went through, so that they're not touching Abraham's land. And so now Abraham finally has his own, and owns literally his very own first piece of land. And even though we said technically all the land, according to God, is his, he physically has a stake in the land now, and he has his very own place. And of course, it's a burial site. And in verse 19, it says that he finally got to bury his wife in the cave that was in the field of Machpelah next to Mamre, which obviously we know is Hebron, in the land of Canaan, which we also knew. So as we wrap up, we just see the last verse repeat what has gone on. He secured the field, and he also secured the burial site in the cave. And now we have the first generation of the people of faith after the flood who are taking a stand for God. And we have the first matriarch who's passed away, but her legacy lives on because God gave her a promise. And she had a son named Isaac. And as we see Abraham in the next chapter starting to get older, we're going to get into one of my most favorite little stories in the Bible, and it's not going to be short when it comes to length, but it is going to be in scale because most people don't even think about or know this story, and we'll cover it in chapter 24 next time. Hey, I'm so glad you guys could join for today's podcast. I hope things clicked for you and that you're able to better understand God's Word. Jesus said, "Whoever has ears to hear, let them hear." So, keep on listening to what God has to say, and I'll see you guys next time. God bless.